Some creatures come into our lives not by chance, but by design we cannot yet understand. Deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington, where ancient pines scrape against storm clouds and silence can drive a person mad, Dr. Elena Vasquez thought she had found the perfect place to disappear from a world that had taken everything from her. 3 years after losing her daughter in a senseless accident, Elena had traded her bustling veterinary practice for a remote cabin, choosing solitude over the painful sympathy of well-meaning friends. She believed she was saving a dying wolf pup when she found him bloodied and broken in the snow that February night. What she didn't know was that Atlas, the magnificent creature who would grow to become her only companion, had been waiting for her just as desperately as she had been waiting for him. Now, as a stranger emerges from the wilderness claiming Atlas belongs to an ancient prophecy that could either save or damn an entire community, Elena faces an impossible choice that will force her to decide what she truly believes about fate, love, and the mysterious forces that guide lost souls toward each other. But what happens when the very thing that saved your life might be destined to destroy others? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The February wind carried teeth sharp enough to flay skin from bone, and Elena Vasquez pulled her wool coat tighter as she stepped onto the porch of her cabin. 3 years in these mountains had taught her to read the sky like scripture. The pewter clouds building on the western ridge promised a blizzard that would lock her in for days. Good. The isolation suited her purposes. She'd made this evening trek to the woodshed every night since moving here, a ritual born of necessity but sustained by something deeper. The rhythmic thunk of splitting logs, the burn in her shoulders, the way physical exhaustion could sometimes quiet the ghosts that whispered her daughter's name in the dark. These things had become her medicine. Maya would have been 13 now, old enough to complain about the cold, to roll her eyes at her mother's insistence on living like a hermit. The thought struck Elena with its familiar precision, a blade finding the space between ribs. She'd stopped counting how many times a day her mind performed this cruel arithmetic, calculating the life that should have been. The first snowflakes began falling as she raised the axe above her head, fat and wet, promising accumulation. She brought the blade down with more force than necessary, splitting the pine log cleanly. The crack echoed off the surrounding peaks, and something answered from the tree line, a sound that made her freeze. It wasn't quite a howl, more like a whimper stretched thin by pain and desperation. Elena lowered the axe, her breath forming white plumes in the frigid air. 23 years as a veterinarian had trained her to recognize suffering in any language, and this sound spoke of something dying. She should go inside, lock the door, build a fire, let nature take its course. The mountains were full of creatures that didn't survive winter. It was the way of things, brutal and inevitable. She'd come here to escape the weight of trying to save everything, everyone, only to fail when it mattered most. But the sound came again, weaker now, and Elena found herself moving toward the trees before conscious thought caught up with her feet. The beam of her flashlight carved through the gathering darkness, illuminating falling snow that danced like static across her vision. Pine branches hung heavy and black above her, their whispered conversations in the wind the only company she'd kept for weeks. "Where are you?" she called, feeling foolish for speaking aloud but unable to help herself. The silence that answered felt expectant, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She found him 30 yards from the cabin, a dark smear against the white ground that her light almost missed. At first glance, she thought it was a large dog, a German shepherd perhaps, left behind by careless hikers. But as she knelt beside the motionless form, her trained eye caught the longer legs, the broader skull, the thick double coat already matted with blood. Wolf pup. Maybe 6 months old, though malnutrition made aging difficult. Someone had hurt him deliberately. The wounds were too precise, too systematic to be accidental. Cuts across his flanks, a gash on his left hindquarter that spoke of traps or worse. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the kind of respiratory distress that preceded organ failure. Elena's hands moved without her permission, checking vitals, assessing damage. Professional instincts died hard, even when you'd sworn off caring. The pup's eyes fluttered open at her touch, amber irises that seemed to hold depths no wild animal should possess. For a moment that stretched longer than physics should allow, they stared at each other. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a door creaking open that she'd welded shut 3 years ago. "You're going to die out here," she whispered. And the pup's tail gave the faintest twitch, as if he understood and was asking her to do something about it. Keeping wolves was illegal in Washington state. Nursing one back to health without reporting it to Fish and Wildlife would cost her the veterinary license she'd spent decades earning. There were protocols, proper channels, rehabilitation facilities designed for exactly this situation. Elena knew all of this with crystalline clarity, even as she gathered the pup into her arms, surprised by how little he weighed. The storm was coming harder now, snow falling in earnest, and the pup's breathing grew more labored with each step toward her cabin. By morning, if she did nothing, he would be dead, another casualty of a world that seemed designed to break beautiful things. Elena had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. She was done standing by and letting it happen. Her cabin appeared through the white curtain of snow, like a ship's light through fog. Warm, safe, isolated enough that no one would question what happened here. For the first time in 3 years, Elena felt something that wasn't grief or guilt steering her actions. Purpose, maybe, or simple stubborn refusal to let this night end the way too many others had. She pushed through her front door with the dying pup cradled against her chest, unaware that she was about to save the one creature that would, in turn, save her. The warmth of the cabin hit Elena like a physical force, and she felt the wolf pup stir weakly in her arms. The fire she'd banked before going out for wood still glowed in the hearth, casting amber light across the sparse living room. 3 years of self-imposed exile had stripped her life down to essentials: a threadbare couch, her father's old rocking chair, shelves lined with medical journals she no longer read. The only photographs were turned face down on the mantel, too painful to look at but impossible to pack away. She carried the pup to the kitchen, where fluorescent light revealed the full extent of his injuries. Blood matted his grey-brown fur, and she could see the steady rise and fall of his ribs beneath skin stretched too tight over bone. Someone had done this deliberately. The cuts were too clean, too methodical for an accident. The realization sent ice through her veins. "Okay, baby," she murmured, the endearment slipping out before she could stop it. "Let's see what we're working with." Elena cleared her kitchen table with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from countless emergency surgeries taking over. Her hands moved to the cabinet where she kept her medical supplies. Old habit died hard, and she'd maintained a fully stocked veterinary kit even in retirement. Sedatives, antibiotics, surgical tools, sterilized and ready. She'd told herself it was for treating her own injuries, but some part of her had always known this moment would come. The pup's breathing grew shallower as she worked, each exhalation a visible puff in the cool air. Elena's fingers found his pulse, thready but present. She'd lost patience in better condition than this, but something about the way he'd looked at her in the snow made giving up impossible. 3 hours later, the wolf pup lay unconscious on a makeshift bed of towels beside the fireplace. Elena had cleaned and sutured his wounds, administered fluids and antibiotics, done everything she could, short of performing surgery she wasn't equipped for. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see if it would be enough. She settled into her father's rocking chair with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the steady rise and fall of the pup's breathing. Outside, the storm raged with the fury she'd predicted, wind howling around the eaves like voices of the dead. The sound used to comfort her, nature's lullaby to match the emptiness in her chest. Tonight, it felt ominous. Elena's phone sat silent on the side table, its screen dark. 3 missed calls from Dr. Sarah Chen at the animal hospital in Bellingham, probably checking in with her monthly welfare call. Sarah had been her partner for 15 years before the accident, the closest thing Elena had to a friend now. But even Sarah didn't know about the sleepless nights, the way Elena sometimes caught herself setting 2 plates for dinner, the recurring dreams where Maya asked why Mommy hadn't been able to save her. The veterinary practice they'd built together sat in trust now, Sarah running it alone while Elena collected disability payments for trauma she'd never officially been diagnosed with. The insurance money from the accident gathered dust in accounts she never checked. What was the point of financial security when you'd lost the only thing worth protecting? The pup whimpered in his sleep, and Elena found herself reaching out to stroke his head before catching herself. Getting attached was dangerous. In a few weeks, when he was stable enough, she'd have to contact Fish and Wildlife. There would be questions about the delay in reporting, probably fines, but her license was gathering dust anyway. What did it matter if they took something she no longer used? But as her fingers finally made contact with the soft fur between his ears, she felt something she'd thought was dead forever, a flutter of protective instinct, fierce and unwelcome. The pup leaned into her touch even in sleep, and Elena's throat tightened. She'd been a good veterinarian once. Before the accident, her waiting room had been full of families trusting her with their beloved pets, their children's best friends. She delivered countless litters, saved animals everyone else had given up on, worked 18-hour days, and never questioned why. Purpose had been as natural as breathing then. Now her days followed the same hollow routine. Coffee at dawn, news she didn't really absorb, long hikes that exhausted her body but never quieted her mind. She ordered groceries online, avoided the town below, spoke to no one for days at a time. It was a half-life, sustainable but meaningless, and until tonight she'd convinced herself it was enough. The pup's breathing evened out, deeper now, and Elena allowed herself the smallest measure of hope. She'd forgotten how it felt to be needed, to have something depend entirely on her skill and dedication. The responsibility terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. Outside, the storm continued its assault, and Elena settled deeper into her chair. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she had a purpose that didn't involve counting the years Maya would never see. For now, that was enough to keep the ghosts at bay. Elena woke to silence. The absence of wind felt unnatural after 3 days of relentless storm, and for a disorienting moment she couldn't remember why she was sleeping in her father's rocking chair. Then she saw the wolf pup, still breathing steadily on his bed of towels, and the previous night came flooding back with startling clarity. Pale morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, revealing a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin's walls in sculpted waves, and the pine trees stood like sentinels wrapped in white. Elena stretched, wincing at the crick in her neck, and checked her watch. Nearly 10. She'd slept longer than she had in months. The pup's eyes were open, watching her with that same unsettling intelligence she'd noticed in the forest. Golden amber irises tracked her movement as she knelt beside him, and his tail gave a tentative wag when she reached out to check his pulse. Stronger than yesterday, steady and sure, the antibiotics were working. "Well, hello there," Elena murmured, running gentle fingers along his neck. No fever, and the wounds looked clean beneath their bandages. "Feeling better?" The pup struggled to lift his head, and Elena's heart clenched at his determination. She'd seen that look before, the refusal to surrender that separated survivors from statistics. Maya had worn the same expression during her brief battle with pneumonia at age 7, jaw set with Vasquez stubbornness, even while burning with fever. Elena was reaching for her medical kit to change his bandages when she heard it, the distant rumble of an engine making its way up the mountain road. She froze, hands suspended over the first aid supplies. No one came here, not the postal service, not delivery drivers, certainly not neighbors. Her cabin sat at the end of a private logging road that most GPS systems didn't even recognize. The engine sound grew closer, accompanied by the crunch of tires on snow. Elena moved to the front window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A battered red pickup truck with chains on its tires was navigating the last switchback before her driveway, exhaust steaming in the frigid air. A pulse quickened. Fish and Wildlife. Someone could have reported unusual wolf activity, though she couldn't imagine how. More likely it was a lost hunter or a county official checking storm damage. Either way, Having a federally protected wolf recovering in her living room presented certain complications. Elena glanced back at the pup, who had lifted his head at the sound of the approaching vehicle. His ears were pricked forward, alert in a way that seemed almost expectant rather than fearful. Strange, wild animals, especially injured ones, typically showed stress at the approach of strangers. The truck pulled into her driveway with deliberate slowness, as if the driver was taking time to study the cabin. Elena ducked away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities. She could hide the pup in her bedroom, claim ignorance if questioned, but the medical supplies scattered across her kitchen table would be hard to explain, and the smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the warm air. A car door slammed, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through snow toward her porch. Whoever this was, they moved with purpose, not the hesitant steps of someone lost or seeking help. Elena's mouth went dry. 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the cabin, firm but not aggressive. The pup's ears swiveled toward the sound, and he made a soft whining noise that Elena had never heard from a wolf before. It sounded almost welcoming. "Dr. Vasquez?" The voice that called through her door was deep, weathered by wind and years. A man's voice, carrying the particular accent of someone who'd spent their life in these mountains. "I know you're in there. I need to speak with you about the wolf." Elena's blood turned to ice water. The wolf. Not a wolf, but wolf. As if her visitor knew exactly why he'd come, exactly what he'd find here. She looked down at the pup, whose golden eyes seemed to hold secrets she couldn't begin to fathom. "Dr. Vasquez," the voice came again, patient but insistent. "The storm's over, but something else is coming. That pup you're caring for, he's not what you think he is, and keeping him here puts you both in danger." Elena's hands trembled as she approached the door. 3 years of isolation had taught her to trust her instincts, and every survival instinct she possessed was screaming contradictory warnings. Run, hide, answer the door, call for help. The competing impulses left her paralyzed, one hand on the deadbolt she'd never expected to need. Behind her, the wolf pup struggled to his feet, despite his injuries. Amber eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible situation she'd stumbled into by saving a dying animal, she was about to discover that some rescues came with consequences that reached far beyond her quiet mountain refuge. The choice before her was simple and terrifying: open the door and face whatever truth waited on the other side, or remain hidden and wonder forever what she'd chosen to ignore. Elena's hand hovered over the deadbolt, her breath coming in short bursts that fogged the cold air near the door. The silence stretched between her and the stranger on her porch like a taut wire, ready to snap. Behind her, the wolf pup remained standing despite his injuries, a soft growl rumbling in his chest, not threatening but almost conversational, as if he were trying to communicate with whoever waited outside. How could this man possibly know? The question circled her mind like a vulture. She'd found the pup less than 24 hours ago in the middle of a blizzard. No one had seen her carry him inside. No one knew she was even here. Her nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down the mountain, and the postal service had stopped delivering to her address after the second winter of returned mail. "I know you're frightened," the voice continued, gentler now but still carrying that strange certainty. "But I'm not here to hurt you or take him away. Not yet. I'm here because you saved something that wasn't meant to die in those woods, and now there are consequences. Consequences." The word sent ice through Elena's veins. She thought of her veterinary license, already hanging by the thread of her self-imposed exile. Thought of the legal ramifications of harboring a protected species. But something in the stranger's tone suggested stakes far higher than professional censure or federal fines. The pup limped toward the door, dragging one bandaged hind leg, and pressed his nose against the wood. His behavior defied everything Elena knew about wild animal psychology. Injured wolves should be cowering, seeking the deepest, darkest corner available. They shouldn't be approaching potential threats with what looked disturbingly like recognition. Elena's rational mind catalogued the impossibilities. A stranger who knew her name, her profession, and somehow the exact nature of her secret. A wolf pup who behaved more like a domestic animal expecting a beloved owner's return. Her own inexplicable certainty that opening this door would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her carefully controlled isolation. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door, heart hammering against her ribs. 3 years ago, she'd made a promise to herself in the antiseptic silence of a hospital waiting room. No more risks, no more chances, no more opportunities for the universe to rip away everything that mattered. The controlled emptiness of her mountain exile was safe, predictable, manageable. But safety hadn't prepared her for the weight of responsibility that came with cradling a dying creature in the snow. It hadn't accounted for the way purpose felt when it flooded back into her hollow chest, and it certainly hadn't considered the possibility that saving one small life might drag her into something larger and more dangerous than her quiet grief. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand why you're hesitating." The man's voice carried surprising compassion. "You've lost enough. The last thing you want is to invite more uncertainty into your life. But that pup chose you specifically. The storm, the timing, even where you found him. None of it was coincidence." Elena's breath caught. How could a stranger possibly know about Maya, about the accident, about the losses that had driven her to this mountainside hermitage? Her isolation had been complete, her past carefully buried beneath silence and distance. The wolf pup looked back at her with those unsettling amber eyes. And for one impossible moment, Elena could swear she saw understanding there. Not animal intelligence, but something deeper, ancient and patient and infinitely sad. The same look she'd carried in her own eyes for 3 years. Her phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, fully charged but useless. Cell service was sporadic at best, and the landline she'd maintained for emergencies couldn't reach anyone who would believe what was happening here. She was alone with an impossible situation and a stranger who spoke in riddles about consequences and choices. Elena thought about Maya's last coherent words in the hospital. "Mom, sometimes scared just means you're about to do something important." 7 years old and wiser than her mother had ever been. The deadbolt felt cold under her trembling fingers. Outside, snow began falling again, not the driving fury of the previous storm, but soft, deliberate flakes that caught the morning light like ash from some distant fire. The world felt balanced on the edge of change, waiting for her decision. Behind her, the wolf pup sat down carefully, favoring his injured leg, but his gaze never left the door. Patient, expectant, as if he knew she would eventually find the courage to face whatever waited on the other side. Elena closed her eyes and saw Maya's face, bright with the fearless curiosity that had made her mother's protective instincts burn so fiercely. "You can't save everyone," the grief counselors had said. "You can't control everything that happens, but maybe, just this once, she could choose to stop hiding from the uncontrollable." Elena's hand moved to the deadbolt, even as every self-preservation instinct she possessed screamed in protest. Whatever came next, she was about to step back into a world where her choices mattered beyond mere survival. The lock turned with a soft click that seemed to echo through the sudden stillness of the mountain morning. The door swung open on hinges that protested with a soft groan, and Elena found herself face to face with a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself. He stood perhaps 6'2", weathered and lean, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a loose ponytail and eyes the color of storm clouds. Deep lines etched his face, not from age but from years of squinting against wind and snow and something that might have been sorrow. He wore a heavy canvas coat that had seen decades of use and boots that spoke of countless miles through unforgiving terrain. But it was his eyes that stopped Elena's breath. They held the same ancient sadness she'd glimpsed in the wolf pup's gaze, the weight of knowledge that couldn't be shared through ordinary words. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice carried the cadence of someone accustomed to silence, each word chosen with deliberate care. "Thank you for opening the door." Behind her, the wolf pup made a sound Elena had never heard before, a low, musical whine that resonated through the cabin like a tuning fork struck in an empty church. The stranger's eyes immediately shifted past her to the small grey form struggling to approach the threshold. "Atlas," the man whispered, and the name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. Elena's world tilted. "Atlas? You know him?" "I know what he is," the stranger replied, stepping carefully into her cabin without invitation, though somehow his presence didn't feel like an intrusion. "What he's meant to become, and I know what his awakening means for these mountains." The wolf pup, Atlas, limped forward with renewed determination, his golden eyes fixed on the stranger with unmistakable recognition. Elena watched in stunned silence as the man knelt down, extending one weathered hand for Atlas to sniff. The reunion was silent but profound, charged with a connection that transcended anything Elena understood about human-animal relationships. "I don't understand," Elena managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found him in the storm. He was dying. I'm a veterinarian, was a veterinarian. I couldn't leave him." The stranger looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You couldn't leave him because you weren't meant to." "Dr. Vasquez, my name is Thomas Crowfeather. I've been searching for Atlas for 3 years." 3 years? Elena's mind reeled. "But he's just a pup. He can't be more than a few months old." Thomas Crowfeather's smile held no humor. Time moves differently for his kind. "What you see as months, I've experienced as years of waiting, years of preparing for the moment when the old agreements would need to be honored." Elena backed against her kitchen counter, seeking the solid reality of familiar objects. Her medical supplies still lay scattered across the table: gauze, antibiotics, surgical thread. Evidence of the rational world she understood, the world where wounded animals were simply wounded animals, and mysterious strangers didn't appear with impossible explanations. "This is insane," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. Some part of her, the part that had recognized the intelligence in Atlas's eyes, that had felt the uncanny certainty of their connection, had been waiting for this moment. Thomas rose slowly, his hand never leaving Atlas's head. "Dr. Vasquez, I know how this sounds, but 3 days ago the tribal elders felt something shift in the deep places of these mountains. Something that's been sleeping for generations began to wake. And when Atlas appeared in that storm, when he led you to find him, it was the first sign that the old protections are failing." "Protections against what?" Elena heard herself asking, though part of her dreaded the answer. Thomas looked out her frost-covered window at the pristine landscape beyond. "There are things in these mountains older than the trees, Dr. Vasquez. Things that were bound by agreements made when the world was younger. Atlas isn't just a wolf. He's a guardian, bred from bloodlines that stretch back to the first treaties between my people and the spirits of this place." Elena's knees felt weak. She gripped the counter harder, her knuckles white against the scarred wood. "You're talking about what? Magic? Supernatural creatures? This is the 21st century. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "It is. And the supernatural doesn't care about your calendar." Atlas had made his way to Elena's feet, pressing against her legs with surprising strength for an injured animal. She looked down into his amber eyes and saw her reflection there, a woman balanced on the knife's edge between the rational world she'd always inhabited and something vast and unknowable. Thomas's voice gentled. "You saved him because you were meant to save him, just as you lost your daughter because some losses prepare us for greater purposes." The mention of Maya hit Elena like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed walls crumbled, and she felt herself standing at the precipice of a choice that would define whatever remained of her life. There was no going back to ignorance now, no returning to the safe isolation of grief. The threshold had been crossed. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps as Thomas's words about Maya settled into the silence like poison. "Don't," she whispered, then louder. "Don't you dare bring my daughter into this madness." But even as she spoke, fragments of memory surfaced unbidden. Maya's uncanny ability to calm frightened animals at the clinic. The way she'd insisted they take the mountain route home that final night, claiming she wanted to see the stars. Her last words about being brave when scared. "I'm not trying to cause you pain," Thomas said, his storm-grey eyes holding steady compassion. "But denying the connections won't make them less real. Your daughter had the gift, didn't she? The ability to sense what others couldn't." Elena's world lurched. She'd never spoken to anyone about Maya's strange intuitions, the way animals gravitated toward her, how she sometimes knew things she shouldn't. Private moments between mother and daughter, dismissed as childhood imagination. "That's impossible," Elena breathed, but her voice carried no conviction. Atlas whined softly and limped toward the kitchen table, nosing at her medical bag. As Elena watched in stunned silence, he carefully extracted a specific instrument, a small penlight, and dropped it at Thomas's feet. "He's showing you proof," Thomas said gently, retrieving the light. "Watch." Thomas clicked the penlight on and directed the beam toward Atlas's injured hindquarters. Where the light touched, the bandages began to emit a faint silvery glow that pulsed in rhythm with the wolf's breathing. Elena's medical training screamed that this was impossible, but her eyes couldn't deny what they were seeing. "The old bloodlines carry light," Thomas explained. "Healing light, protective light. It's why your treatments worked so well. You weren't just treating a wolf, you were helping a guardian recover his strength." Elena grabbed her stethoscope with trembling hands and knelt beside Atlas. His heartbeat through the earpieces was strong, steady, and accompanied by something else, a secondary rhythm, like an echo, that seemed to resonate from somewhere beyond his physical form. "This isn't possible," she whispered, but she moved the stethoscope to different positions, confirming what her instruments detected. Atlas's entire circulatory system hummed with energy that defied every law of biology she'd ever studied. Thomas's expression grew grave. "Dr. Vasquez, what do you know about the Native American reservations in this area?" Elena forced herself to focus beyond the impossibility of Atlas's condition. "There's the Quilcene Band territory about 40 miles north. Some of the older families have been there for generations. 7 generations, to be precise. Since the Treaty of 1868, when my great-great-grandfather agreed to bind the old dangers in exchange for protection." Thomas moved to her window, scanning the tree line with obvious unease. "But the binding requires renewal. It requires a guardian to walk the boundary lines during the winter solstice, reinforcing the spiritual barriers. And Atlas is supposed to be this guardian?" Elena's scientific mind rebelled even as she asked. "The last guardian died 3 years ago. Old age, natural causes. We thought the bloodline had ended." Thomas turned back to her, and Elena saw fear flickering behind his steady composure. Then Atlas appeared, impossibly young, somehow reset to begin the cycle again. But he's not ready. The binding ceremony requires a guardian at full strength, fully trained in the old ways. Atlas struggled to his feet and moved to Elena's side, pressing against her legs with deliberate pressure. When she looked down, his amber eyes held unmistakable urgency. "He's trying to tell us something," Elena said, surprised by her own certainty. Thomas nodded grimly. "The winter solstice is in 6 days. If we can't restore him and complete the binding—" He trailed off, studying the darkening sky beyond her window. "Complete it or what?" Elena demanded. "Or the things that were locked away in 1868 will break free. Wendigo, shadow walkers, entities that fed on human fear and flesh until my ancestors found a way to contain them." Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Dr. Vasquez, there are families on that reservation. Children. If the barriers fail—" Elena felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on her shoulders. Atlas leaned harder against her legs, and she could swear she felt that strange secondary heartbeat through the contact, pulsing with trust and desperate hope. "You're asking me to believe in monsters," she said. "I'm asking you to believe in what you've already seen. Your hands healing what shouldn't heal. Your intuition leading you to save a life that needed saving." Thomas stepped closer, his weathered features etched with urgency. "Elena, you're not just a veterinarian who happened to find a wounded wolf. You're the person Atlas chose." the person his bloodline recognized as capable of helping him fulfill his purpose. Outside, the wind began to howl through the trees with a sound that seemed almost like voices, hungry, ancient voices that made Elena's skin crawl. Atlas's ears flattened against his head, and his lips pulled back in a silent snarl directed toward the growing darkness. Time was running out, and Elena finally understood that her choice wasn't whether to believe in the impossible. It was whether to fight against it or embrace it before it was too late. Elena's hands trembled as she stared into the gathering dusk beyond her window. The hungry voices in the wind seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, and Atlas's agitation mirrored her own rising panic. 6 days. 6 days to somehow restore a mystical wolf guardian and perform an ancient ceremony that stood between the reservation and horrors she couldn't even imagine. "What exactly do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas moved to her kitchen table, pushing aside medical supplies to spread what appeared to be a hand-drawn map across the scarred wood. The parchment looked ancient, covered in symbols that hurt Elena's eyes to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't focusing on them completely. "The preparation has 3 phases, Thomas explained, his finger tracing paths across the map. Physical restoration, spiritual awakening, and the binding walk itself. Atlas is healing well under your care, but his true strength won't emerge until he connects with the sacred sites." Elena studied the map, recognizing some geographical features despite the otherworldly markings. "These locations, they're all within a day's travel from here. The mountains chose this place for your cabin carefully," Thomas said. "You've been living at the center of a spiritual confluence for 3 years, Dr. Vasquez. The same energies that drew you to isolation also prepared you for this moment." The implications made Elena's head spin. Her retreat to the mountains after Maya's death hadn't been random. It had been guided by forces she'd never acknowledged. The peace she'd found here, the way her grief had gradually transformed into something bearable, even her inexplicable certainty about treating Atlas, all of it connected to a purpose larger than her own healing. Atlas limped to the map and placed one careful paw on a symbol near what Elena recognized as Mirror Lake. Where his pad touched the parchment, the mark began to glow with the same silvery light she'd witnessed earlier. "He remembers," Thomas said with obvious relief. "The bloodline memory is intact. That's the first site, the Well of Reflection. Tomorrow we'll need to take him there for the awakening ceremony." Elena's practical mind seized on logistics as an anchor against the supernatural tide threatening to overwhelm her. "He can't travel that far on an injured leg. The terrain is too rough, and if he reopens those wounds, then we carry him." Thomas's interruption was gentle but firm. "Elena, normal veterinary concerns don't apply here. Atlas will draw strength from the sacred sites, not lose it. Each location we visit will accelerate his healing and unlock more of his guardian abilities." Outside, something crashed through the underbrush near her cabin. Elena rushed to the window, peering into the darkness beyond her porchlight's reach. For a moment she thought she glimpsed movement, shapes that seemed wrong somehow, too angular to be natural wildlife, moving with predatory purpose through the trees. Atlas erupted in a deep, resonant howl that Elena felt in her bones. The sound carried warning, challenge, and something that might have been authority. Whatever had been approaching her cabin retreated with sounds of snapping branches and displaced snow. "They're testing the boundaries," Thomas said grimly. "The entities can sense Atlas's presence, but they can't approach while he's under your protection. Your cabin sits on blessed ground. Maya made sure of that." Elena spun to face him. "What did you say?" Thomas's expression softened with sympathy. "Your daughter spent her last weeks here, didn't she? Playing in these woods, talking to animals that seemed to understand her perfectly. She blessed this place with innocent intention, Dr. Vasquez. Her spirit still guards it." The weight of revelation drove Elena to her knees. Maya's final requests to visit the mountains, her insistence on exploring every trail, her habit of leaving small gifts for the wildlife, flowers, carefully arranged stones, drawings tucked into hollow trees. Elena had thought it was just childhood whimsy, but Maya had been preparing a sanctuary. Atlas pressed against her trembling form, his warmth solid and reassuring. Through their contact, Elena felt an echo of something familiar, the same fierce love and protective determination that had defined her relationship with Maya. The wolf pup carried pieces of her daughter's spirit, threads of connection that death hadn't severed. She knew, Elena whispered. Somehow, Maya knew this would happen. Children with the gift often do, Thomas confirmed. They see the patterns adults miss, understand the connections we've trained ourselves to ignore. Maya prepared you for this moment, Elena. She made sure you'd have the strength to choose correctly when the time came. Elena rose slowly, her grief transforming into something harder and more focused. The isolation she'd embraced for 3 years suddenly felt like training rather than retreat. Every quiet day in the mountains, every moment of learning to live with loss, every small act of healing she'd performed on the local wildlife, all preparation for this impossible responsibility. Atlas looked up at her with ancient eyes, and Elena finally understood what she saw there. Trust. Maya's trust, passed through death itself into a guardian who needed her courage to save hundreds of lives. The wind outside carried fresh menace, but Elena no longer felt afraid. She felt ready. The readiness Elena felt lasted exactly until dawn. She woke to Atlas whimpering beside her bed, his golden eyes wide with pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. Through the cabin's windows, the morning light carried an unnatural quality, too pale, too thin, as if something were draining the warmth from the sun itself. "Thomas," she called, but received no response from the couch where he'd spent the night. Elena found him outside, standing motionless at the edge of her property line. His weathered face was drawn with exhaustion, and she realized he'd been awake all night, maintaining some kind of vigil against the darkness. "It's starting," he said without turning around. "The barriers are weakening faster than we anticipated. We have hours, not days." Elena's medical training kicked in, analyzing symptoms of an impossible diagnosis. What does that mean, exactly? Thomas pointed toward the distant mountains, where Elena could now see what looked like storm clouds gathering. Except these clouds moved against the wind, pulsing with sickly yellow light. The entities are massing at the weak points in the binding. Each breach makes the next one easier. Atlas limped to Elena's side, and she gasped at the change in him. Overnight he'd grown, not just larger, but somehow more substantial, as if his very presence carried greater weight. His amber eyes held depths that made her dizzy to look into directly. "The awakening is beginning without us," Thomas said grimly. His guardian nature is responding to the threat, but without proper preparation, without the ceremonies. He trailed off, but Elena understood. He'll burn himself out trying to hold the barriers alone. Atlas pressed against her legs, and Elena felt it immediately, a rushing sensation like electricity flowing between them. Images flashed through her mind, dark shapes pouring through cracks in reality, families fleeing in terror, children screaming as shadows given substance pursued them through familiar streets. Elena jerked back from the contact, gasping. "I saw... God, what were those things?" "Wendigo. The first ones to break through." Thomas's voice carried the weight of generational memory. "They feed on human flesh, but they consume hope first. They turn victims into more of their kind before killing them." The rational part of Elena's mind, the part that had guided her through medical school, through years of surgical procedures, through the terrible mathematics of Maya's final moments, screamed that this was impossible. Monsters didn't exist. Ancient curses belonged in movies and folklore, not in the sterile reality of the 21st century. But Atlas whined again, and Elena looked down to see his injured leg had completely healed. Where bandages had covered deep gashes yesterday, only smooth fur remained. More impossibly, his coat had begun to shimmer with that strange silvery light, pulsing in rhythm with his increasingly labored breathing. "He's trying to maintain the barriers from here," Thomas said. "But the distance is too great, and he's too young. Dr. Vasquez, we need to reach the first sacred site within the hour, or Atlas will die trying to do alone what requires the full ceremony. Elena's hands shook as she gathered supplies, her medical kit, camping gear, emergency provisions. The familiar weight of preparation grounded her, even as her world tilted into impossibility. This was triage on a cosmic scale, and her patient was a mystical wolf whose survival meant the difference between sanctuary and slaughter for hundreds of innocent people. Atlas struggled to follow her movements, but Elena could see the effort was costing him. Each step seemed to drain more of his strength, as if invisible chains were pulling at his spirit, demanding he hold positions he wasn't ready to maintain. "The reservation," Elena said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "How many people?" 347, Thomas answered immediately. 86 children under the age of 12. 86 children. Maya's age when the accident took her. Elena felt something crystallize inside her chest, not acceptance of the supernatural, but something deeper, recognition. This was why Maya had prepared this place, why Elena's grief had led her to these exact mountains, why Atlas had appeared in her path during the worst storm in decades. "Mirror Lake," Elena said, shouldering her pack with hands that no longer trembled. "How far?" 3 miles through terrain that's going to fight us every step of the way. The entities know what we're attempting. Thomas lifted Atlas carefully, cradling the growing wolf against his chest. "They'll try to stop us." As if summoned by his words, the unnatural clouds on the horizon pulsed brighter. And Elena heard something that made her blood freeze, children's voices calling for help, echoing impossibly across the vast distance from the reservation. Atlas's ears flattened against his head, and he began to glow more intensely, his light pushing back against shadows that hadn't existed moments before. "Those aren't real children," Thomas said quickly, seeing Elena's expression. "Not yet, but if we fail—" Elena checked her watch. 7:43 a.m. Somewhere beyond those mountains, families were probably having breakfast, getting children ready for school, living normal lives without any idea that their continued existence balanced on the survival of a mystical wolf and the courage of a grief-stricken veterinarian. The ordeal had begun, and there was no turning back. The first mile toward Mirror Lake nearly killed them all. Elena had expected difficult terrain. Fallen logs, steep inclines, patches of ice hidden beneath deceptive snow. What she hadn't anticipated was the way the forest itself seemed to fight their passage. Branches that should have bent away from their bodies whipped back with vicious intent. Solid ground gave way beneath their feet at crucial moments, sending them stumbling into hidden ravines. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, turning their breath into clouds of ice crystals that stung their lungs. Atlas grew heavier in Thomas's arms with each step, not from physical weight but from the increasing effort required to maintain his barrier work. His silvery glow flickered like a dying flashlight, and Elena could hear his breathing becoming labored even over the howling wind that had risen from nowhere. "How much farther?" she gasped, helping Thomas navigate around a tree that had somehow fallen directly across their path since they'd passed this way an hour earlier. 2 miles, Thomas replied, but his voice carried doubt. "If the lake is still where it's supposed to be." Elena was about to ask what he meant when she understood. Through the swirling snow ahead, she could see the familiar outline of Broken Ridge, except it was on the wrong side of their route. The mountains were rearranging themselves, stretching the distance to the sacred site. "They're buying time," Thomas continued grimly. "The longer Atlas stays disconnected from the well of reflection, the weaker he becomes. And the weaker he becomes, the more barriers collapse." As if to punctuate his words, a sound echoed from the direction of the reservation, a howl unlike anything Elena had ever heard. It carried hunger and ancient malice, the voice of something that had waited decades for freedom and finally tasted it. Atlas convulsed in Thomas's arms, his glow sputtering out entirely for several terrifying seconds before reigniting weakly. When the light returned, Elena saw blood trickling from his nose. "Put him down," she ordered, her veterinarian instincts overriding the supernatural crisis. "He's hemorrhaging. We need to—" Dr. Vasquez. Thomas's interruption was gentle but firm. Normal medicine won't help him now. He's bleeding because he's fighting a spiritual war across 40 miles of territory. The only treatment is completing the ceremony. Elena knelt in the snow beside Atlas, checking his pulse with trembling fingers. His heartbeat was erratic, that strange secondary rhythm she'd detected earlier, now completely out of sync. Through her stethoscope, she could hear what sounded like distant screaming. "I'm losing him," she whispered. 3 years of careful healing, 3 years of slowly learning to live with loss, and now she was watching another life slip away beneath her hands. The familiar weight of helplessness crushed down on her chest. Atlas opened his amber eyes and looked directly at her. In their depths, Elena saw not just the wolf she'd raised, but something vast and ancient and utterly exhausted. For a moment, she felt the crushing weight he was carrying, the spiritual pressure of holding back entities that wanted nothing more than to feed on human terror. Then the connection snapped, and Atlas went limp. "No," Elena breathed, feeling for a pulse she couldn't find. "No, not again. Not like this." She began CPR, pumping the wolf's chest with practiced precision, breathing air into his lungs, counting compressions as she'd done 1,000 times for animals that had teetered on the edge of death. But this time felt different. This time, she was fighting not just against mortality, but against forces that wanted Atlas to fail. Thomas stood over them, his weathered face etched with grief. "Elena, he's gone. Without the ceremony." "He's not gone," Elena snarled, continuing her resuscitation efforts. "I didn't save him from freezing to death just to lose him now. I didn't spend 3 years." Her voice cracked. "I didn't bury my daughter just to watch everything she prepared fall apart." But Atlas remained motionless beneath her hands. No heartbeat, no breath, no silvery glow. In the distance, Elena heard more howls, a pack of them now, answering the first call. The barriers were collapsing faster without Atlas's power to reinforce them. She could feel it in the air itself, a wrongness that made her skin crawl and her vision blur at the edges. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Dr. Vasquez, we need to evacuate the reservation, get as many people out as we can before—" A child's scream cut through the mountain air, real this time, not the phantom voices they'd heard earlier. Somewhere in the distance, the entities had broken through completely. Elena looked down at Atlas's still form, then at the strange map in Thomas's hands where sacred sites were going dark one by one. Everything they'd planned, everything Maya had prepared for, everything Elena had trained herself to handle, all of it had failed. The Guardian was dead, the barriers were falling, and 347 people, including 86 children, were about to face horrors that had been contained for over a century. All seemed lost.